The snail, to get rid of its troubles, transforms its eyes into horns. There are many snails like this.
Medieval illuminators, serious artists meticulously reflecting the atmosphere and action of a given book, or rather pranksters and meme creators, forming their own fantastic universes. Hi, it's Galahad here and you're watching another episode of History Telling. It will focus on the motive of a knight fighting a snail, one of the most frequently studied. Medieval books usually couldn't do without illuminations, i.e. decorations. They often appeared in their margins, hence the name marginal decorations. In the Gothic period, and especially in the 13th and 14th centuries, the most popular kind of marginal decorations was drollerie. In French, drôlerie means playfulness. These were small illustrations depicting humorous scenes whose characters were people, animals, and fantastic creatures. When the copyist finished rewriting the book, it was time for the illuminator to step in. Responsible for filling in the remaining empty spaces, he often let his imagination run wild, most often not referring to the content or character of the book at all. He just wanted to amuse or arouse admiration in the reader. In ancient times, the snail often symbolized excessive distrust. As he always carried his house with him, he could hide in it at any moment. In the Middle Ages, these interpretations were replaced by others, which compared the snail to, among others, a coward or a parasite, crawling on its belly. In addition, it also often symbolized false courage due to the illusory strength of its shell. The motif of a knight fighting a snail emerged in the illuminations of northern French manuscripts in the late 13th century. Soon after, it also appeared in Flanders and England, where it persisted until 1320s. To this day, over 70 depicted duels of knights and snails have survived in 29 manuscripts, both in small regional works and in more prestigious ones, enriched with other illuminations and illustrations. Initially, this motif was most strongly present in northern France, but over time it moved to Flemish and English manuscripts and ultimately began to weaken. After it died out in the 1320s, the motif was briefly revived at the end of the 15th century. Depictions of the motif of the knight and the snail varied from one another. In some cases, the knight fought on foot and was armed with a sword, club, or a spear, and sometimes also a shield. The duel could resemble a jousting match, with a charging horseman wielding a lance and shield, galloping towards the snail. In some cases, the knight was depicted as a human-horse hybrid or a human griffin, creating a creature resembling a centaur. Occasionally, his place was taken by a monkey, a man dressed in a short tunic, or even completely naked. In one case, it was a naked woman holding a spear and shield. As for the snail, it often appeared as big as a dog or a cat. It sometimes raised its horns aiming at the enemy. In some instances, a woman begged the knight not to attack the snail, but he often chose to engage in battle anyway. Sometimes the duel ended in the knight's defeat. He would drop his sword and kneel before the victorious snail. This could indicate the satirical nature of these depictions. Shortly after the motif became popular in manuscripts, it also appeared in sculpture. For example, in the 13th century series Virtues and Vices, depicted in bas-reliefs in the cathedrals of Notre-Dame in Amiens and Chartres. The most common interpretation of the motif seems to be the one that portrays the snail as a symbol of human cowardice, Latin imbelles, and laziness, Latin ignavia, as well as false courage. For this reason, the snail was an opponent of many knights who wanted to prove their own bravery. The fact that they usually failed to do so may explain the frequent illuminations of victorious snails. It is possible that this was a way to mock the then incompetence in respecting the codes of chivalry. Some scholars, like for example Lillian Randall, believe that the negative traits represented by the snail were associated with popular stereotypes of Italians in medieval France. They were described by Jacques de Vitry as cowardly, malicious and greedy, while Odofredo considered them ignorant and simpletons. On the walls of the university in Bologna, where he lectured, French students drew snails to make fun of Italian students. In France, there were also stories about the Lombards. In the mid-14th century, Giovanni Villani described them saying,
"And pay attention to the story that is passed down orally and through paintings to spite the Italians in France. They say the Lombards are afraid of snails."
The popular medieval French poem, The Lombard and the Snail, Latin De Lombardo et Lumac, told the story of a simple Lombard peasant encountering a heavily armed snail with horns. The gods promised him great rewards for killing the beast. However, his wife begged him not to leave her and their children, and not to embark on such a dangerous journey. Nevertheless, the brave Lombard eventually pierced the snail with his spear. This story, popular in France, was another mocking satire on the people of Lombardy. Why did the French attribute traits like cowardice to the Lombards? To answer this question, we must go back to the year 772. At that time, the Lombard king Desiderius invaded the lands of the Pope, who called on the Franks for help. Their numerous armies soon entered Lombardy. According to the Frankish monk Einhard, in an attempt to avoid confrontation, Desiderius fled the field 4 times, until he finally took refuge in the capital of his state, Pavia. At the sight of Charlemagne, he was said to tremble with fear and his adjutant to eventually faint. This story survived in French minds. In the 12th century, poems began to be written on this topic. But how did the stereotype of the cowardly Lombard transfer to England and the Netherlands? In the 13th century, Lombard usurers and bankers were widespread in these lands. Their rapid expansion provided them with a monopoly in these professions, together with the Jews. Already then, the names Lombard and usurer became synonyms. Despite being accused of greed and deception, their services were popular. However, identifying snails with Lombards is called into question by Sarah J. Biggs. She argues that Randall overlooked the issue of knights, who in many cases lose or flee from the alleged Lombard snails. It doesn't exclude an interpretation in which the knight symbolizes the cowardly Lombard, as in the poem De Lombardo et Lumac. Other researchers believed that the knight fighting the snail is simply another manifestation of the Mont Reversi motif that was very popular in the illuminations of medieval manuscripts. In French, it means world turned upside down. It satirically reversed roles. The knight became a hare, the hare a knight, or, as in this case, the knight was a coward and fled the snail. According to this view, the motif had no deeper purpose than to entertain or intrigue the reader. Some researchers go even further and link the motif to the pyramid of classes in the medieval society. The Belgian writer Maurice Maeterlinck called the snail motif
satire on the powerful who in their fortified castles laughed at the threat of the poor whom they exploited.
Another noteworthy, though unpopular interpretation is the comparison of the snail coming out of its shell to the resurrection of Lazarus. Comte de Bastard mentioned it in 1850, explaining the presence of the motif in the description of this biblical event. Modern medievalist Lisa Spangenberg also points to Psalm 58.
Let them vanish like a slug, melting away as it moves along.
It describes the punishments that will befall dishonest judges. Those can be knights for whom snails are a foretaste of punishments for their sins. An interesting interpretation is also the one presented by Jean Fleury, a 19th century realist. He simply understood the motive of the knight and the snail as a struggle of men against pests in agricultural crops. The motive of knights and snails was, as most interpretations suggest, a reaction to the social situation of the time. However, we don't know whether it referred to vain knights, cowardly Lombards, or perhaps lower social classes. The intensity of its repetition caused it to quickly lose its novelty and ultimately survived in medieval illuminations for a relatively short time. All this makes it similar to the 21st century concept of a meme. That's all I wanted to tell you in today's episode. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and rate the video. See ya!